I'm just going to say at the top of this conversation how jealous I am and was. This is such an incredible opportunity, and I hope that they'll run the trip again because I want to go with my girls, who are college age, and so it's an incredible opportunity in part because of being able to experience it with Emma, with your kid, but also because of the colleagues who you were able to sit with and learn with and navigate this really difficult moment with together. Can you talk for a moment about what inspired you to join this trip at this time?
Yeah. Well, I got an email from my mom that was just like a forward from, I think it was Yona or Leia, had sent her an email inviting her on this encounter trip. And normally when I get these emails, it's something that I like look at and sort of push to a side and I'm like, I'm not doing it for my, like, whatever. And I saw this and I was really intrigued. And then I checked my calendar and it happened to work with my school calendar. And it felt like an opportunity that I really couldn't turn down. I've spent, I don't know, over a year of my life all in Israel. And I also hadn't been back since my gap year between high school and college, which was 2015, 2016. So it had been almost a decade. And I felt like this was an opportunity for me to sort of refocus my perspective and sort of relearn what the reality on the ground was. I think a lot of the way that I thought about Israel and how I thought about this conflict was still through the lens of the 2015, 2016 Israel trip that I was on. And on the other side of the coin, I think one of the things about Israel that is so hard to explain is there is sort of this magic and this like fabric of, I don't know, there's something sort of magical about being in Israel. And I think having not been there for 10 years, I had really lost that magic. And I think that it had really pushed me away from the conversation and also pushed me away from support for Israel. And so being back, I thought would offer me an opportunity to sort of recommit to my love of Israel, but also to my deep, deep trouble and conflict that I feel about the area as well.
You're listening to IKAR podcasts, where you can hear our sermons from Shabbat, our teachings, our guest lectures, the whole Megillah. Today, Rabbi Sharon Brous is joined by the CEO of IKAR, Melissa Balaban, and Melissa's daughter, Emma Wergeles, who not only grew up in IKAR, but is currently in her last year of law school at American University and is hoping to pursue a career in civil rights litigation. They're here to talk about their trip to Israel and Palestine with Encounter. Encounter is an educational organization committed to informed, courageous, and resilient Jewish communal leadership on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
You know, I think one of the things that's been hardest about the Israel-Palestine discourse for many of us for the last many years, but especially since October 7th of 23, is that there's such a binary in this conversation. There's a good and evil. There's a kind of simple oversimplification that has actually led good and decent people down the path of utter dehumanization, which is so hard to witness. And I think we see it in both camps. We see that there are really good and decent people who are either Israeli or in the Jewish community who just can't think about Palestinian civilians. It's too painful. They cannot think about hunger and about loss and about an entire generation or multi-generational clans being wiped out in Gaza in this horrific war. There are really good and decent people who are human rights activists and people who care deeply about the world, and they cannot bring themselves to see victims of the atrocities of October 7th as innocent victims, as people who should be alive, as kids who are at a dance party or in bed in their kibbutz, most of them peace builders themselves. And I've been struggling with this for the last year and a half. How quickly and how easily we have gotten to the place of total dehumanization. And how do we respond to that? The conversation's grown so thin. How do we
Yeah.
thicken the conversation so that we can actually reclaim some of the humanity? And I think that's part of what Encounter does so beautifully. And I wonder if you can start to tell us a little bit about what you saw, heard, and experienced by way of what stretched you, what helped you encounter ideas that gave more air and more spaciousness to the way that you, even though both of you are complex thinkers, might have even flattened out in your own understanding over the course of these traumatic and sorrowful days that we've all experienced.
Right. I think, I mean, this is what Encounter does so incredibly well. And one of the things that I kept thinking about is dimensionality, that when we are here and reading and listening to what's going on, we really see Israel Palestine as this two-dimensional situation. And what happens when you go there is you see the multiple dimensions of everybody, of everybody's hearts, of everybody's focus. There are people living their lives. Israelis who are on the ground working for peace and protesting the government, Palestinians who, even in everything that they're suffering, they're seeing a broader horizon to what it could look like, but also the complexity of just being in Israel, Palestine, walking down the street in Tel Aviv and hearing the call to prayer, the Muslim call to prayer. It's something that I feel like people who are not, haven't visited, don't understand the multidimensionality of that place. And what Encounter does so well is really try to layer that in for us. So you can, and some of it's really hard. Some of it's hard to hear. It's stuff you don't want to hear, you don't want to know about. And yet hearing it really helps you understand as you said, that it isn't that we aren't flattening our understanding, but we're really understanding that this is humanity that we're talking about, humanity on all sides, and people struggling through it and really trying to find some light and some possibility, even in all of the destruction and sadness.
I want to get tachlis with you. I want to get really practical for just a couple minutes. If you can give us a sense of some of what you saw and heard here. Most American Jews have not been into the West Bank. If they have been to the West Bank, they've probably been to Jewish Israeli settlements there. They have not been into Palestinian communities. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you experienced both in East Jerusalem, in places where you visited? What voices do you want us to hear that you were able to hear live that you can now share with those who are listening?
So there's a couple, and I'll go first, and then you chime in. There's a couple of voices that stick out to me. One is a Palestinian woman, and she was there with her 4 adult children. And one of the things she said that really stuck with me is the hardest job in Palestine is being a mother. And then she said, but I also talk to my Israeli friends, and I know that their kids are about to go into Gaza on the Israel side. And I have empathy for them too. And I was so shocked that she was able to do that and able to see that. Her adult daughter sitting next to her said, I don't have any empathy. They don't have to go into the IDF if they don't want to. So that generational divide was super interesting too. And on the flip side, we met with an Israeli woman who actually works for Encounter, lives in Efrat, lives in the settlements. And I said to her, what is it like to live here? And how do your friends react? And she said the truth. And how do you work at Encounter? And she said, I have to fight with myself every single day that this is the right thing to do. And she has, I think, 6 kids or 8 kids. One is 6 months old and one is 18. 18 is about to go into the army. And she said, what I hope is that my son, when he goes into the army, that he has in the back of his head some of what I'm learning here, some of the empathy that I'm learning here, and that he takes that into battle. And at the same time, I'm scared that if he takes that into battle, it could get him killed. And to me, that was such a moment of understanding the dichotomy here, that people are just living in this world of stretching your hearts to be able to empathize with other folks at the expense of your own children is super hard. And yet I saw more of that in some ways than I expected.
Thank you. What about you?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things that I noticed, and I think this sort of speaks to empathy and capacity for empathy as well, is a lot of the Israelis we spoke to sort of felt like they had no ability, not because they don't care, but because of everything going on in their lives, they had no ability to think about what was happening in Gaza, right? Like it wasn't a defense of what's happening in Gaza. It wasn't, acceptance. It was just sort of this like I my the capacity that I have to have empathy is so limited right now, and it's all being invested in, the hostages and the people who survived October 7th. And there was also sort of the sentiment that like they didn't have the capacity to have these conversations. And it sort of felt like that was accepted. Like it was okay that Israelis sort of weren't there right now because of the trauma that they had endured. And the interesting thing was on the other side, when we were talking to Palestinians, they were like, right now we need to have these conversations. And I
Mm.
think, and all of the Palestinians we spoke to, correct me if I'm wrong, but they all spoke about the atrocities of October 7th and decried the violence and said that it was horrible and that innocent people shouldn't die, which I think is sort of, a very basic sentiment.
Baseline. Yeah.
But it was sort of interesting that there was this grace sort of given to the Israeli people that we spoke to. Like, it's okay, like you can take some time and like sort out, the trauma that you've experienced, which they absolutely should. Um, but for the Palestinians, there's this sense of urgency. And I think what was so different about that is what's happening in Gaza right now is worse than anything that has happened there before. But also, Palestinians have been living under occupation, under military control, and for the past however many years. And so, for them, they experience trauma every day. And they sort of talked about how one of them said, and I think that this is a challenging thing to hear, but one of them said that every day for Palestinians is like October 7th.
Mm.
And I think that one demonstrates empathy, right? It demonstrates sort of their ability to understand that the violent acts happening are bad on both sides. Um, but it also was just sort of, I think, a reminder that I think, as American Jews have really sort of, it almost feels like in a lot of ways the clock has reset since October 7th, in how we have these conversations, or that like October 7th sort of served as this like turning point. And I don't think I think it's true for Palestinians in the sense that the occupation has increased, the military control, their freedom of movement has been even more limited than it already is. But every day for them, they have been living in this occupation. And so I think hearing that like Israelis aren't ready to have these conversations, and also that Palestinians are like, this urgently needs to happen, was a hard sort of thing to grapple with. And also, we spoke to Palestinian teenagers who had no interest in speaking to people who they called Zionist or who had served in the IDF or anything along those lines. And so there is this sort of grouping of people who want to have conversations, who won't want to have conversations, who don't want to have them yet. And it feels like we're all sort of talking around each other, which I think is really interesting. And I think we need to figure out how to bridge those divides before anything positive happens.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what you said, Em, not everything, but there is a reasonable and understandable empathy gap. I think in some ways there's more empathy than one expects at this moment, on somewhat on both sides, but particularly from Palestinians who are really invested. Except many of them are really invested in what peace can look like, and some of them have no patience for it at all. I mean, and I would say it's generational there pretty significantly. Like they're like, we don't want to have conversations. We don't want to know. We don't want to even we don't want to be in a room with a Zionist. That isn't ever going to happen. And so I think that's reasonable given what's going on. But I do think there are a lot of people who are fighting through that obvious need to pull back from that empathy and diving in a different kind of way.
We had like an intro call before we all went on the trip, and part of what we did on this introduction, like all of the participants of this encounter trip, and one of the things we did is we went through and talked about some of the values that encounter had sort of laid out for us. And one of them talks about how Palestinian and Jewish safety and Palestinian and Jewish, life and
Future.
on the word future, yeah, are inextricably linked. And one of the things that I said is I feel like there's a lack of empathy here. And I think that this notion that here is in the States, and I think this notion that Jews and Palestinians are linked is sort of more accepted in Israel. It sort of feels more obvious there, where I don't think it is here. And so this empathy gap is something that I've really been struggling with here and sort of figuring out how to bridge this empathy gap, because I feel like the way that we talk on social media, the way that we talk to each other, it's so absolutist.
Mhm.
And I think we just need to, like, I sometimes think people forget that we're all humans and we're all talking about human life and innocent life. And I think if we, as a society, just paused and sort of remembered that, I think we could have conversations in a much more productive way.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Emma, that like here there isn't this sense that they're inextricably linked, because it's like either the Jews win, either the Jewish Israelis win or the Palestinians win. And there, it's pretty clear to almost everybody, I think, that there's, as you've been preaching for years, Rabbi Brous, is that there's two people, nobody's going anywhere, and we have to figure out a way to live together. I mean, I do think there are certainly elements of Israeli society who would never use that language, but I think it's very clear to almost everybody we spoke to that there are two peoples here and nobody's going anywhere. And that's it's so missing from the conversation here.
It's so I'm so moved by what you're saying, and I think about how hard it is for human beings to acknowledge that we can be both victim and victimizer at the same time,
Mm.
because
Well,
our identity is so often formed around what happens to us. And and
Yeah.
that makes it, and so I have this sense for many years now, when I hear Palestinians speak, I think all my Jewish neurons are ignited. And I think, oh my gosh, I can so relate to that as a Jew.
Mm.
And there's this way in which Jews and Palestinians, whether they're Israeli Jews or American Jews or diaspora Jews, that Jews are particularly and uniquely situated because of our
mhm.
historic experience to empathize with the Palestinian struggle. And that Palestinians, because of their unique historical experience, they're particularly um, and uniquely situated to understand the Jewish struggle. And
Yeah.
yet there's the biggest divide here. So
Yeah.
that's
I
something
And
want
we
to
had a
say,
Palestinian who said exactly that to us. She said
yes.
exactly that, like, who better to understand your Jewish pain than us? And that's why we need to be part of this solution. We need to be engaging in it. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and similarly, another Palestinian, I think at the same panel, if I'm remembering correctly, Ali Abu Awad said, and this has stuck with me so much. He said, "The Jewish people are not our enemy. It is Jewish fear."
oh,
And I think that the way that what you just said is exactly right. Like we have this big, someone else said a different night, like Jews aren't good at being in power. Like we don't
That's right.
have the experience leading a country. That is not something that we as a people have ever done. And so I think those things sort of connect in the sense that like the Israeli government is operating, and I think a lot of Israelis are operating out of fear. And I think that fear is totally justified because we have been a victim for eons, right? Um, but I also think we need to figure out a way to see past that fear and to also recognize that right now we have the ability. My usage of we is very confusing to me, but whatever. Um, like Israel has the upper hand right now, and I think sort of reconciling like your fear of the past with your hope for the future is essential, because you can't live a life operated by fear.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, that same person who talked about like Jews don't know how to be in power, and do it well. And that same person talked about sort of the two kinds of Zionism, the Zionism of fear and loyalty tests and everything else. And then there's the Zionism of an optimistic Zionism and creativity. Like, where did the creativity come when at the beginning of the Zionist project, where did we start? How did we start going back to that optimistic creativity rather than from fear? Because if you're operating from fear, you're not going to you're not going to make good decisions. And I think that's been evident in everything that we've seen.
It's interesting. I met with a Palestinian woman just before winter break, and she said she's a New Yorker, and it's interesting. She looks really Jewish. She looks like Barbara Streisand, and so people always mistake her for a Jew, and so she actually has been the victim of anti-Semitism. Interestingly, and she even at Palestinian, she shared the story that she went to a pro-Palestine protest in New York City, and someone came in with an anti-Semitic sign with swastikas on it, and she went over and she's like, get that shit out of here. There's no place for that in the struggle for Palestinian liberation. And the guy started screaming, shut up, you stupid Jew. And she's like, I'm literally Palestinian and you're not. So anyway, but she said something very similar to what you're saying. She said, there's nothing I can do to make a Jew feel safe from your historical trauma. Right? That trauma, that multi-generational trauma is so embedded in our system. This is what Harold Schulweis called the dominant psychic reality of the Jew, is like you wake up one day and they're gas chambers. And so, so she's like, I'm just a Palestinian mom. There's nothing I can do to convince you that you're safe. And so like you're fighting against your own trauma and your own fear, and my freedom depends on it, which I found to be really painful and really important and hard to hear. Emma, is there a moment that you can share where you felt like you encountered a perspective or an idea that sort of took you by surprise?
Yeah, I mean, I think what was so interesting about this trip is the people we heard from, like the speakers, the Palestinians, the Israelis. I learned so much from them. As much as I learned from the speakers on this trip, I found that the hardest conversations and the conversations that stretched me the most were the conversations that I was having with the other participants. And I think what was so interesting about this trip is there was sort of this expectation that the younger generation and the older generation would fit squarely into left and right. And it really turned out that that wasn't the case at all. There was really wide, I mean, I can't actually speak for the older generation, but at least among the younger generation, there was a really wide range of perspectives. And so I think that was a really interesting element, sort of understanding that there's been this sort of compartmentalizing of the older and the younger generation into these boxes, and I don't think those boxes really fit everyone or fit in the way that they necessarily are trying to. And I also think everyone on this trip went on this trip because they were willing to have these conversations and willing to be open. And so I think the flattening that you talk about, which feels so omnipresent when I'm here and when I'm at home, didn't feel so strong on the trip, because I felt like there was sort of this baseline understanding that we're all here to have these really challenging conversations. And I also think I've been really lucky that I am able to talk to my mom about really challenging topics, and sometimes we yell at each other and sometimes we get mad and we disagree, but like we always hang up the phone and we say, I love you, have a good day. And I feel really fortunate to be able to say that. But and so I hadn't really had this like intergenerational struggle in the way that I had heard people talk about. And I felt like with other people from the older generation on this trip, I sort of saw that. And so it was interesting to sort of see how my perspective did sort of fall into the line of like younger generation versus older generation with other people from the older generation on that trip.
I keep thinking back to something that Ezra Klein shared as the kind of generational, the way that he explained the generational divide, which I think is so resonant. So he said that there's the really my parents' generation, for whom Israel was David in a sea of Goliaths, struggling to survive, built by refugees from the Holocaust and from people who fled violence in Arab lands, and just trying, all we want is to live here. All we're asking for is some tiny, humble slice of land. That was the core narrative. Then there's my generation, which really came of age with regards to Israel in the 90s, where Israel was strong already, but was striving for peace. And there was Oslo, and there was all this hope and possibility. I mean, my years in Israel in college and grad school were during that kind of era of, we can do this. We can build a new Middle East, a different kind of future. And then there's my kids' generation, which is your generation, where where Israel is strong and not striving for peace and entrenching in the settlement enterprise, and there's a growing extremism. Mika Almog, who's the granddaughter of Shimon Peres, said to me once when she was trying to explain the culture shift in Israel over the course of the 2000s. She said, "Imagine if Donald Trump were president of the United States for 12 years. What would be the cultural norms?" She said this at the time when he had just been elected in 2016. And she said, just imagine what starts to take root and how the country shifts. And she said, that's what we've been experiencing under the Netanyahu regime now. And for longer than anyone ever imagined. Like the country's turning. So there's a generation that's grown up only really seeing Israel as strong and not striving for peace, but instead articulating an annexationist, extremist agenda instead. And so, that resonates. And I also see the way that's not true for everyone. It's not even true for in my family, that those are the assessments and analyses that we have. So I like what you're saying. I mean, there's some truth to the generational, to the myth of the generational divide. And also, even here, we shouldn't be generalizing about about generational experiences, because some people are different. Sometimes my kids, I'm like, can I please pull you a little bit to this side? But in the other direction, then most people are, then so many people are pulling their kids. Melissa, what do you think?
Well, one thing I was going to say is I thought the most extraordinary part of the trip was the younger generation, because I do think we tend to think of them as very absolutist and think one way and don't think in complex ways and don't, they use social media and everything's in a certain number of characters. But this was not the case. This was the most thoughtful, extraordinary group of kids, and I hate to say kids, but young adults who were really willing to think differently, be push us, but in such smart and thoughtful ways that they didn't fall into that stereotype at all. And I think all of us in the older generation, at one point, one of the rabbis, we had broken up between the older generation and the younger generation, and some of the parents were lamenting, oh God, how could we be exposing our kids to this awful stuff, and maybe we're giving them language that they didn't even know. And one of the rabbis said, I think the kids are all right. The kids are really smart and able to discern and dissect and think in a complex way, and not just for them, but for us. And that was really, it gave me, even as many depressing and awful things as I saw, it gave me actual hope and optimism for the future, because I really feel like these are the folks who are going to be thinking through these issues as we go forward. And they are really thinking about it in multidimensional ways. And it gave me great hope.
It's interesting. I remember that critique from our IKAR community trip too, because we felt it was really important to go into the West Bank and to hear from Palestinians, and to just give our people access on the ground to a visual for what the occupation looks like and what it is actually doing to real people's lives. And I remember that there was some criticism about that. There were a lot of kids on our trip, and there was a sense that we were teaching them to hate Israel. And our argument was, no, if we don't do this, then they will have no idea how to even love Israel. They won't know how to be in an honest relationship with Israel, because this is the weight around Israel's neck right now. And being dishonest about it and hiding from it does not help your children build a rich, and lifelong relationship with this place. It's our sacred responsibility. And you shared a story with me when you came home from this trip about one of the students on the trip who saw a visual of a crane in the old city, or near the old city, and had it seemed like some opening in understanding about what was being built. Can you share that a little bit? Because I think that it reflects the kind of counter testimony to this criticism, that if you introduce people to the problems that are on the ground, it's only going to make them, flee.
I do think I just want to add, like, parents are supposed to protect their children. And I also think that protecting to an extent where we don't know how to do things on our own or think about things on our own is more damaging than beneficial. And I think one of the great things about this trip was that our parents weren't putting us in this box, and they were really letting us explore. And I think to the fear of, like, showing your kids the things that are happening in Israel that are horrible and egregious is just teaching your kids to hate Israel. To me, I grew up understanding Israel's complexity and very, probably reductively and in a way that was fit the age of my brain at the time. But so many of my peers went off to college, learned about what was actually happening, and either like doubled down and were like, we have to defend Israel at all cost, or they were like, oh, like I don't want anything to do with that. I'm taking a step back and Israel is no longer my problem. And I think by teaching your kids what is actually happening, it gives them a way to love Israel without illusions about what's actually happening in Israel. And I think also like trust that your kids are thinking, and that your kids are smart, and that they care, and that they're passionate about these things. I think one of the things that the younger generation felt at times on this trip was this sort of this protectionism, or this sort of infantilizing of like, we know better. And you don't always know better. But I will say, oftentimes my mom is right, and I'm happy to admit that. But
I found
sometimes she's
that
not.
too. Yeah.
Do you want to say what you said something really beautiful at that last session too, about what it about engaging with Israel in like, do you remember what you said?
I had very little real life experience of seeing Israel try to pursue peace. Has not happened in my lifetime. On small levels, maybe here and there, but from like compared to Oslo and all of those other sort of bigger moves towards peace. And so I felt like I had very little goodwill left for Israel. Honestly, like I think someone asked me why I don't give Israel the benefit of the doubt, or why I assume they're in the wrong. And my answer to that is, well, I have no reason to give them the benefit of the doubt. I have no evidence that Israel or the Israeli government is going to do the right thing, because they've not shown me that they can do the right thing. And on the last night of the trip, we were standing on this rooftop in a hotel in Jerusalem, and you could sort of oversee the entire old city and most of the city. And it was really beautiful. And I said that the way that Israel looks right now is not okay. It's not sustainable. It is not peaceful. It is dehumanizing, demoralizing. It is everything bad that I think a state can be. And I think that part of the reason why Israel is so complicated is because I often feel like the government is doing the things that they're doing and claiming that they're doing it in defense of Jewish safety. And I resent that. And I don't want to be identified as someone who thinks that that's the right thing to do for Jewish safety. And I think because of that, it had been so easy to just sort of pull away and be like, these are not my people. These are not the people who speak for me. I don't want to be a part of this. I don't want to associate with it. And in full disclosure, when we went on this trip, I sort of wanted to hate being there. I wanted to sort of walk into this country and feel like everything everywhere was tainted by what the government was doing in Gaza. Massive, massive amounts of innocent people are being killed. And so I was sort of hoping that like the entire country had become consumed by this war. And in a lot of ways it has. I think there's some fear and stuff. But to my mom's point, like there is just so much more dimension to this than the way that we talk about it at home. And I think being in Israel and sort of not hating being there, which made me uncomfortable in its own right, sort of reinvigorated the passion that I have for this issue. And, it would have been, I think it's always much easier to be on one side of the pole of the spectrum, right? Like wrap yourself in the Israeli flag and cheer on Bibi with, unconditional support, or walk away from it altogether. And I think that this trip just sort of reminded me that we can be in the middle, and that we can actually care about both things. We can care about Palestinian statehood. We can care about, ending the war and whatever else that entails. And we can also care about Israel. And I think to me, what caring about Israel looks like is pushing Israel to be the best version of itself.
Yeah, it's beautiful, Ems. And you're describing that rooftop scene, and we walked out on the rooftop, and just what's it's sort of like everything that's incredible and complicated about Israel, because you see the old and the new and the Dome of the Rock and the old city and East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem and all the building and construction that's going on. It's like all of the challenges right there in front of your eyes. And there was this giant crane right in front of us. And one of the younger generation said, which I thought was really profound, he said, this is really a metaphor for the entire thing. We're building this. We're building this, and our generation, I don't think I'm getting his exact words because they were much more eloquent than I would say, but our generation is also responsible for building this. And the older generation has to trust that we're going to build this in a good way too. And that was, I think that was really moving to see sort of the evolution of his thinking as we went through the week.
There are a couple threads here that I want to pick up on. One, I mean, I can't help but think that we have now entered an era here in the United States where many of us are in deep misalignment with the government that will be representing us in all kinds of ways and engaging in policy change and
You mean here? You mean in this
here in the
country?
United States and both domestically and internationally in the name of the American people will be doing things that utterly horrify us. And so we're going to be reminded of what we already know as Americans, which is that we as a people are not in any way defined by our government, and that even if we are in a real minority, that our voice of dissent, our voice of resistance has to matter. And it's the only way that we can responsibly live under a regime that really is out of step with our values. So the first thing I want to say is I think sometimes in the Israel-Palestine discourse,
Right.
people forget that this is a society that's filled with lots of people who feel about their governments and the people who engage in war and violence on their behalf very similarly to the way that we feel about the Trump administration. They're horrified by it. And, you know, you don't see that so much in the United States. In fact, I was greatly disappointed when the democracy protests were bringing hundreds of thousands of Israelis to the streets every single Saturday for 10 months before October 7th, from the time that this most right-wing government in Israel's history came into power. And there's this group of, you know, Israeli Americans who were trying to drive support for the democracy protesters here in the United States. And the tens of thousands of Jews in LA who would show up at the Israel Day celebrations did not show up to fight for Israel's democracy on the street. Like, there's one way to support Israel from here. And it ends up being to support really the right-wing government of the state of Israel. That's not so true in Israel. There are lots of different ways to be Israeli there. And even the symbol of the resistance is the Israeli flag, which is kind of mind-blowing for people, you know, who don't have the experience of being there. So I'm really interested in what you're saying about sort of differentiating between the government, the military, and the people, while also recognizing that there has been a massive and significant culture shift over the course of the past several years, especially the last 2 years, but really the last 20. And, you know, we just heard, and Melissa, I think you shared this with me from your trip, that of the 150,000 new voters, new eligible voters in Israel's upcoming election, that 75% of them are Ben Gvir supporters, meaning supporters of the far right, now former, thank God, national security minister, because he just stepped down out of the government. He just left the government over the ceasefire and hostage deal. But that is a huge shift. I mean, this guy was a far fringe voice, and now 75% of the new voters will support him. So we have to both differentiate the people from the government while also acknowledging that there is a massive culture shift that we've witnessed, and that puts, in many ways, the majority of Israeli Jews in a kind of misalignment with the majority of American Jews. I think that's just a
That's
reality.
right. I think you're right. And I think, but it's an interesting analogy, because I think there is a minority, but mighty minority of Israelis who are fighting for the soul of the country in the way that the minority folks here are fighting for the soul of our country. And I think they get lost in the shuffle with all of these conversations, but there are the filling civil society filling the gaps that the government couldn't even do right after. They couldn't even function after October 7th. And they had civil society folks who were leading those protests who were filling in the gaps by getting stuff to soldiers and feeding people and finding them houses, like basic stuff that the government should have done. And at the same time, there's also, because we always talk about the Palestinians, that they don't have a leader and there's no partner for peace, and that's how they talk about it. There are a small but mighty group of people who are fighting for the soul of the Palestinian people and hoping for, the leadership to emerge, that nonviolent leadership that will that are working on civil society and structure and infrastructure for the Palestinian people. So it is happening on all sides. And I think our job, what came clear to me, is that our job as American Jews is to amplify those voices as much as possible, the Palestinian and the Israeli, because they are there, but they don't get enough play in the noise and the one-dimensional thinking that people are throwing around here in the United States. That was what was so important that's what's so incredible about people like Ali Abu Awad, who leads the nonviolent movement in Palestine. And because he really understands the Jewish fear. He's not dismissing it. He really understands it.
Yeah.
And he gets that the only way we can get to a good place is to get past that fear together. And it's a very interesting, it's sort of a remarkable ability to empathize that under his circumstances is particularly amazing.
Right. And I also think that October 7th sent us back a generation, because
sure.
it just reinforced that incredibly profound sense of vulnerability. I think that's true both for Jews and our trauma, and also for Palestinians. And this, I mean, so many people have spoken about how this awakened the Nakba trauma, just this sense of total, displacement and dispossession from the land. And I think it will take a generation to at least to recover from that. Over the summer, I was in Jerusalem, and I was in a room with 200 plus American rabbis, and the lecturer in the front of the room is Israeli, and he was talking about anti-Zionist Jews, and he said, "Let me tell you something. If you are an anti-Zionist American Jew, you are not part of the Jewish people. You are no longer a part of my family." It was such a striking moment. First of all, because I think many of those rabbis have kids who now this lecturer is saying, your kids aren't part of the Jewish people anymore because they don't share this idea. I'm struck by the tenderness of something that you said, Emma, in contrast to what that lecturer said, which is, we need to have this generation, the parent generation, trust that our kids are actually thinking and feeling. And we don't always see things the same way. And there is a generational shift, even though we don't want to be too generalized in our talking about it. But we have to trust that there's something, when we make blanket statements that like push people outside of the community because of perspectives they hold, we're doing the same thing that people are doing to Zionists, to Jews, to Palestinians. Like we have to stop looking at people in these grossly general ways, and instead try to understand where people's hearts are, and try to hear them and hear where the pain is and where the sorrow is. And that's part of the reason that that I think this experience was so powerful. There's one more thing that I want to share about this, which is I think that it's really clear that the American Jewish script with regards to Israel is a broken and dangerous script. And for many decades, because of fear and trauma, which we've discussed a bit in this conversation, there was a sense that that kind of criticism, Emma, that you were talking about earlier, would lead to the destruction of the Jewish state and and to great harm to the Jewish people. What that did was it shut down the conversation, so that there wasn't a healthy discourse in our Jewish communal infrastructure. And I think it's so clear that we need a new script. And I'm so aware of how dangerous it is when the new script is the mirror image, like the funhouse mirror of the old script. Like you were extreme this way, so I'm going to be extreme this way. And what strikes me as so powerful is this model of kind of carving out a space where we can speak honestly and humanly and curiously and compassionately about Israelis and Palestinians, about the struggles of today, the dangers of this moment, and also the dreams of the future. That doesn't quash out the creativity because the central driving force is rage at the other that grows out of our own fear for our own safety. And so taking this trip, going over there, I know it's not easy. It's not an easy trip to do. And you just doing that, I feel like you're putting breath, you're putting air into a conversation that greatly needs to be expanded. You're becoming the authors of the new script that we are going to need to write in order to have a just future. And so I'm so grateful to both of you for being in that conversation and for all the ways that what you learned there will reverberate out as a result. I'm going to give you each a chance to share one last thing, and then I want to close with some wise words of a friend of mine.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, I 100% think that the script has been broken. We talked about this on the trip, that if the American Jewish community had been in a real relationship and real dialogue over the past 30 years, would Israel actually look different right now if we were willing to do what Emma says and be in a relationship where sometimes you're telling your best friend that they're screwing up. So that really resonates with me. And I was thinking about two really hopeful things that we did. One was we saw the Jerusalem Youth Chorus, which is half Palestinian teenagers and Arab citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis. And they meet like 4 to 8 hours a week, and they sing and they learn and they get to know each other. And they're like, we watch them sing, but we also watch them interact with one another and experience each other's problems and hear each other teenage problems, not necessarily the gadol problems, and it was so heartwarming. You thought, oh God, this is where the future is. If these people can engage in conversation, then there is actual hope. And then the other place that I felt was really moving is a place called Field Bait, which is this art and cultural center on the seam line in Jerusalem. So between West and East Jerusalem, and it's run half by Palestinians, Arab citizens of Israel, and half by Israeli Jews, and they do art and cultural and programming together. And even through all of this challenge, they have made it through, and all they want to do is bring more art and beauty into the world. And I remember hearing just a few months ago about how the Irish conflict was not solved by government, it was solved by civil society that started to develop. And if more and more of these civil society organizations and people who are engaged in building civil society from an art and a cultural and a political perspective, that's, I think, where the hope is and possibilities are for the future of this place.
I totally agree with you. And I want to add, I just want to add a tag to that, which is for people who are here, who are feeling a little bit helpless watching all of this unfold, both here in terms of the binary reaction and there. One thing we can do is really support civil society there. We can support the New Israel Fund, which is the umbrella organization that's funding a lot of the great work that's happening on the ground there. There are so many brave Israelis and Palestinians who are working to imagine and then to actually activate that future. So thank you for sharing that. Em, last word.
Yeah, so one of the speakers that we heard from is a Palestinian. I don't remember exactly how she identified, but she's a Palestinian Arab citizen of Israel. And she is like very, very senior at Hartman, a Palestinian woman who identifies very much as a Palestinian woman and is working in this space full of Jews and Zionists. And one of the things that she said, which reminded me of something that you had said prior, Rabbi Brous, was when something is built on sin, everything that happens after that is just another, it's like layering sin, right? And I think most modern states and countries were probably built on sin. And so I think that it's important to also remember that when we have these conversations. But it reminds me of the article that you wrote, I don't know, probably 10 years ago about the story. I don't know if it's a Mishnah. I don't know where it came from. Some Jewish story about the stolen beam and how you use that as an argument to sort of push the country towards reparations. And I've been thinking a lot about the stolen beam, and since we're speaking about Israel, I'm going to keep it confined to that, but I do think this is a conversation that can apply pretty globally. But how do we as a society pay for that stolen beam? And how do we, as a community, do what we need to do to make amends and to sort of provide reparations for the stolen beam? And I think so many people were displaced in 48 and have been displaced since then, or are refugees, or have lost everything. And I think it sort of all comes back to like what can we do to make up for this stolen beam? And how can we, I don't know, I think sometimes I really feel like Israel just needs to be re-injected with Jewish values, because I know that my Jewish values would not manifest in this way. And I think reminding ourselves that like every life is an entire universe, and when one person dies, that's an entire world that disappears, no matter whether they're Jewish or Palestinian or Israeli. And so I don't know, I think there's so many positive and like meaningful and powerful Jewish values that you both have taught me and have raised me with. And I think Israel just sort of needs a reminder. It needs to remember who we are, why we exist, and as Jews, how we want to be seen by the world and how we want to interact with people in a way that reflects the values that are so central to our community and our religion.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
That same Palestinian woman from Hartman said, she said, if Jews could yearn for this space, this place after 2,000 years, how do we not understand the Palestinian yearning for what they lost in just the last 80? And I thought that was such an important focus for us to understand. I don't know how it manifests, but I think it's important.
To Emma's point about reinfusing Jewish ideas and values into Israeli society, on one of my encounter trips to Ramallah, I met with Sam Bahor, and he pleaded with our group. He said, please don't leave your Jewish hearts on the plane when you land at Ben Gurion Airport. Just bring that sensitivity, that tenderness, that commitment to justice, bring it here too, because we need strong Jewish values in this place. That's how we build a future. So I am going to close with the words of your father, Adam Wergeles, because he wrote this really powerful, maybe prophetic piece in 2014 or 2016.
The letter.
Yeah, it was a letter to my daughters. And at the end of this piece, he says, the once concentric circles of your Jewish community and your social justice community are now more like Venn diagrams with an ever receding area of commonality. Yet mercifully, you have not changed. You are still the living manifestation of our greatest hopes and aspirations, galvanized by the Jewish spirit and imperative of narrowing the chasm between the world as it is and the world as it should be. However, you must not allow yourselves to be bullied into giving up a part of yourself for the sake of ease or social comfort. Such an outcome would be a tragic capitulation to a false choice and a rejection of your birthright. Instead, you must join with others in forging a new path, a path that honors the singularity of your Judaism, love and concern for Israel, and the ethical and moral imperatives that guide you. Only by following that path do we have a chance of bringing the once concentric circles back into alignment. I want to close by saying amen to Adam Wergeles. And Melissa and I were with Van Jones a couple of weeks ago at a dinner. He's working really hard to bring the Black and Jewish communities and Black Jews into dynamic dialogue in this time. And he said something about how you have to remember that there were not a lot of people involved in the civil rights movement. He said there weren't a lot of Black Americans involved in the civil rights movement. There weren't a lot of anybody. There was a small, committed core group of people that just had a different vision for America and collectively advanced that vision. And we are definitely in the minority now. The folks who haven't stopped listening to this recording already by now because you're so angry by something that one of us said. We're definitely in the minority, and that doesn't mean that we're wrong. It means that at the end of the day, we have to plant the seeds for a different kind of future, a future in which Israelis and Palestinians can live in a just peace, which means a peace in which every one of us and our children are able to truly thrive and not be afraid. And I know that that's possible. I know that a shared society is possible. And so thank you both for your willingness to step into the fire here, and thank you for sharing this wisdom with us now. I know there's a lot more for us to learn from you in the days ahead.